The first thing I heard was the knock, slow and deliberate, the kind of knock that isn't asking permission. It echoed through the quiet of my backyard just as the late afternoon sun hit the surface of my pool, turning the water into a sheet of bright blue glass. I was standing barefoot on the warm concrete deck, a towel slung over my shoulder, the faint smell of chlorine and freshly cut grass drifting through the air. Then I heard the second sound, the short burst of a police radio outside my front gate. That's when I knew this wasn't a normal neighbor dispute. I walked around the side of the house and opened the gate. A black and white patrol cruiser was parked halfway across my driveway, engine idling, sunlight flashing across the windshield. Standing beside it was Officer Daniel Hayes, one hand resting casually on his duty belt, the other holding a clipboard like he was here to write a parking ticket. Behind him, arms folded and lips curled into a thin, satisfied smile, stood his wife, Victoria Hayes, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association and the self-appointed ruler of our quiet suburban cul-de-sac. Her phone was already raised chest high, camera pointed straight at me. Recording. Of course she was recording. Victoria never missed a chance to create a spectacle. The faint scent of her expensive perfume floated across the driveway, even from 10 feet away, sharp and floral, clashing with the warm smell of pavement and pool water. "There he is," she said brightly to the phone, as if she were hosting a neighborhood news broadcast. The homeowner refusing to follow community rules. Officer Hayes cleared his throat and stepped forward with the slow confidence of someone who believed the badge on his chest solved most arguments before they even started. "Afternoon, sir," he said, voice calm but firm. "We're here about the pool." I glanced past him at Victoria. She tilted the phone slightly to keep both of us in frame, her smile widening like someone who had been waiting all week for this moment. A few of the nearby houses had front doors cracked open now, curious neighbors watching from behind screen doors. The whole street felt quieter than usual, like the air itself was holding its breath. "Your wife already sent 3 letters about the pool," I said evenly. "I responded to all of them." Victoria let out a short laugh that sounded more like a cough. "You ignored them," she corrected, her voice sugary but sharp. "Your private pool violates the HOA community access policy. Residents are entitled to shared recreational facilities." I looked over my shoulder at the water shimmering behind me, the pool I'd built 2 years earlier entirely on my own property, inside a fenced backyard that sat well outside HOA jurisdiction according to every document I'd ever read. "That policy doesn't apply to private installations," I said. "We both know that." Officer Hayes shifted his weight, boots scraping lightly against the gravel of the driveway. "Sir," he said, tone tightening slightly, "my wife has filed an official HOA complaint. Under that complaint, we're requesting that you hand over the pool access keys until the board reviews the matter." Victoria's phone tilted closer to my face as if she were trying to capture every reaction. The late afternoon sunlight reflected off the cruiser's chrome bumper, sending a bright flash across the pavement. She looked thrilled, like she'd finally found the moment where the neighborhood troublemaker would be forced to fall in line. "Just hand them over," she said sweetly. "This will all go much faster." I studied the officer's badge for a moment, then glanced back at the patrol car idling behind him. The engine hummed softly in the heat, steady and patient. Victoria was smiling wider now, certain she'd already won. What she didn't realize was that the moment her husband stepped onto my property wearing that uniform for her HOA argument, this quiet little pool dispute had just become a federal problem. I did not reach for the keys. Instead, I leaned one shoulder against the wooden fence beside the gate and let the quiet stretch out for a second. The late afternoon heat sat heavy over the cul-de-sac, the kind of Texas summer warmth that makes the pavement smell faintly like hot stone and lawn fertilizer. Somewhere down the street a sprinkler clicked slowly back and forth, the steady tick-tick-tick echoing across trimmed lawns and identical mailboxes. Victoria Hayes kept her phone pointed straight at me, clearly enjoying the attention. Officer Hayes waited, patient but confident, like a man who had performed this routine many times before. What neither of them understood was that the pool behind me was the least interesting thing happening in my life. My name is Ethan Caldwell. Most of the neighbors in Willow Creek Estates believe I am a quiet consultant who works remotely for a financial analytics company in Dallas. That is the story I gave when I moved into this house 14 months ago with a pickup truck a few boxes, and a lawn chair. The story fits nicely in a place like this. People here understand spreadsheets and conference calls and long hours behind a laptop. It explains why I keep irregular hours and why packages sometimes arrive late at night from different cities across the country. It also explains why I spend long stretches sitting on my back patio with a notebook instead of attending neighborhood cookouts. What the neighborhood does not know is that the laptop inside my house connects to a secured federal network, and the notes in that notebook are not business strategies. They are observations, names, timelines, patterns, the quiet routines of people who believe nobody is paying attention. Willow Creek Estates might look like any other peaceful American subdivision, with tidy driveways and basketball hoops above garage doors, but the small city that borders this neighborhood has been sitting on the radar of a federal investigation for almost a year. A complicated web of financial favors, zoning decisions, and quiet influence trading that reaches from the city planning office to local contractors and a handful of people who believe their connections protect them. My job is to watch, to listen, to stay invisible long enough for the bigger picture to come into focus. That is why I chose a house on a quiet corner lot with a tall wooden fence and a backyard pool that gave me a reason to spend hours outside without anyone asking questions. From that deck, I can see 2 intersections, 3 driveways, and the rear entrance to the community clubhouse. A surprisingly useful vantage point if you know what to look for. Unfortunately, Victoria Hayes noticed me long before I noticed her. She introduced herself 2 days after I moved in, stepping onto my porch with a clipboard and a smile that looked practiced in a mirror. She talked for 20 minutes about community pride, property values, and the importance of respecting HOA guidelines. I listened politely, signed nothing, and kept my answers short. That was the moment I became a problem. In her mind, Victoria Hayes does not like unanswered questions, and she definitely does not like residents who do not treat the HOA handbook like a sacred document. Over the next few months, the letters started arriving. First about the height of my grass, even though it measured exactly 2.5 inches like every other yard on the street. Then about the color of a storage shed that sat entirely behind my fence. Then about my pool, the same pool that was built with a city permit and inspected twice by the county. Each complaint arrived with a little more frustration behind it. Each time I responded calmly with copies of permits and the same polite sentence. My property sits outside the HOA recreational access agreement. Victoria never liked that answer, which is why she eventually decided to bring her husband into the conversation. And now here we were, standing in the middle of my driveway with a police cruiser idling behind him and half the neighborhood watching from their windows, waiting to see if the quiet guy with the pool was finally going to back down. Victoria Hayes lowered her phone for a moment and glanced at her husband, as if silently asking why I had not already surrendered the keys. The small pause seemed to irritate her. The air felt warmer now, the sun dipping just low enough to stretch the shadows of our houses across the street. A breeze drifted through the neighborhood, carrying the faint smell of chlorine from my pool and barbecue smoke from somewhere down the block. One of the neighbors shifted behind a half-open garage door, pretending to rearrange tools while watching the scene unfold. Victoria raised the phone again, making sure the camera was aimed directly at my face. "This is exactly what I have been dealing with," she said to the invisible audience behind the screen. "A homeowner refusing to cooperate with community standards." Her voice carried across the quiet street with the kind of confidence that comes from believing the crowd is already on your side. Officer Hayes took another step forward, the leather of his duty belt creaking softly as he moved. He was trying to keep the tone professional, but there was a trace of impatience in the way his jaw tightened. "Sir," he said again, slower this time, "we are not asking for a complicated process here. My wife represents the Homeowners Association, and the association is requesting temporary control of the pool access until the board resolves the complaint. All we need from you is the keys." Victoria nodded enthusiastically beside him as if the matter had already been decided. She turned slightly toward the houses across the street where a few silhouettes were visible behind curtains. "See," she said brightly. "This is how the community works when someone refuses to follow the rules. The association steps in." I studied the two of them for a moment. Victoria with her phone raised like a trophy. Daniel Hayes standing square in my driveway. Uniform crisp, badge catching the sun in small flashes of gold. The patrol car behind him hummed quietly, the steady idle of the engine blending with the distant whir of lawn mowers somewhere across the neighborhood. It was a carefully staged scene whether they realized it or not. Victoria had the audience she wanted. Her husband had the authority he believed would end the conversation. From the outside, it probably looked like a simple HOA dispute about a backyard pool. The kind of suburban argument that ends with paperwork and a reluctant handshake. But what caught my attention was not Victoria's camera or the watching neighbors. It was the detail on Officer Hayes' uniform. The department patch stitched neatly on his shoulder. The nameplate polished bright against the fabric of his shirt. Hayes. The same last name that had appeared more than once in a set of municipal permit approvals I reviewed 3 months earlier. The same last name that showed up in a quiet property transaction tied to a construction contract currently sitting inside a federal case file. Most people would have missed that connection. But I had spent the last 14 months training myself to notice patterns like that. Victoria cleared her throat impatiently when I did not respond right away. "Are you refusing to comply?" she asked, voice suddenly sharper. I looked at her phone, then at the badge on her husband's chest, then back at the street where the neighbors were still watching through narrow openings in their doors. The scene had become exactly what Victoria wanted. A public moment. A small suburban courtroom with her holding the camera and her husband holding the badge. She smiled again, convinced that the next few seconds would end with me handing over the keys. What she did not understand yet was that the moment her husband decided to step into this argument wearing that uniform, the story she was filming had quietly become evidence. The silence stretched long enough that even the neighbors watching from behind their windows seemed to lean forward a little. Victoria Hayes shifted her weight on the driveway, clearly irritated that the scene was not unfolding as quickly as she had imagined. The phone in her hand remained pointed directly at me, the small red recording light reflecting in the glass like a tiny warning beacon. Officer Hayes glanced back at his cruiser for a second, then returned his attention to me, the way a man does when he believes patience is the final step before authority takes over. The low rumble of the patrol car engine continued behind him, steady and mechanical, like a metronome keeping time for the moment. "Sir," he said again, this time with the tone of someone who expected the conversation to end. "I need a clear answer. Are you refusing to turn over the pool access keys to the Homeowners Association while the complaint is under review?" Victoria nodded enthusiastically as if she were grading the exchange and already knew the outcome. The sunlight caught the edge of her phone as she angled it slightly higher to capture both of us. "Please say it clearly," she added with a bright, practiced smile. "The board will need a record that you declined a lawful request." Her confidence filled the driveway like thick summer air. From her point of view, the situation was simple. The Homeowners Association had rules. Her husband wore a badge. The neighborhood was watching. In Victoria Hayes' world, those 3 things usually ended every disagreement. I glanced past them for a moment at the houses lining the street. The same identical brick facades, the same trimmed hedges, the same quiet driveways where children usually rode bicycles in the evenings. Today the street had become something different. A stage. A quiet suburban courtroom where everyone waited to see who would fold first. I could see the top of Mr. Callahan's head behind the edge of his garage door across the street. The Johnson family's blinds shifted slightly as someone moved behind them. Even the mail carrier who had been halfway down the block had slowed his truck enough to watch the exchange from the corner. Victoria noticed the attention and smiled wider. She lived for moments like this. "You know," she continued smoothly, turning slightly toward the camera, "this is exactly the kind of resistance that forces the association to take action. We try to keep things cooperative, but sometimes residents simply refuse to respect the community." Officer Hayes cleared his throat and adjusted the position of the clipboard under his arm. "Let us keep this simple," he said, voice calm but firmer now. "Hand over the keys, and the association will hold them temporarily. Nobody wants to escalate a small issue." Escalate. The word hung in the air between us. I studied the badge on his chest again, the polished metal catching the sun in a brief flash of gold. He still believed this was about a pool. Victoria still believed this was about HOA authority. Neither of them seemed to realize how carefully they were stepping into something much larger. I finally straightened away from the fence and stepped forward 1 pace onto the driveway. The warm concrete radiated heat through the soles of my feet as I stopped a few feet in front of Officer Hayes. Victoria leaned in slightly, clearly expecting the moment where I would reach into my pocket and surrender the keys. Instead, I looked directly at the badge on his uniform, then at the nameplate beneath it, and spoke slowly enough that the phone camera would capture every word. "Officer Hayes," I said calmly. "Before we go any further, I want to make sure something is absolutely clear about why you are standing on my property right now." I let the last word settle into the warm evening air and watched their reactions carefully. Victoria Hayes tilted her head slightly, her smile tightening at the corners as if she thought I was about to deliver some dramatic excuse about privacy or personal rights. The phone in her hand remained steady, camera fixed on my face. Officer Hayes shifted his stance, the faint creak of leather coming from the holster on his belt as he adjusted his weight. The engine of the patrol car behind him hummed softly, and somewhere down the street a dog barked once before falling silent again. It was the kind of quiet suburban moment that normally meant nothing. But moments like this often reveal more than people expect. "Clear about what?" Officer Hayes asked, his tone still controlled but noticeably less patient. I glanced briefly at Victoria's phone again before answering. She wanted a recording. She wanted a clean story she could show the HOA board later. I had no reason to deny her that. "About the reason you are here," I said calmly. "Because from where I am standing, this does not look like an official law enforcement matter. It looks like a private HOA complaint." Victoria let out a quick laugh that sounded almost triumphant. "That is exactly what it is," she said brightly, turning slightly toward the camera again. "The association has every right to request compliance from residents who violate shared facility policies." Officer Hayes nodded in agreement and tapped the edge of the clipboard lightly with his pen. "The association requested assistance," he said. "I am simply facilitating communication so we can resolve the issue peacefully." I let that explanation sit for a moment. The breeze shifted slightly across the driveway, carrying the faint scent of chlorine from the pool behind me and the dry smell of cut grass from the Johnsons' yard. Across the street, someone quietly pulled their garage door another inch higher, just enough to see more clearly. Victoria noticed the movement and lifted her chin slightly, enjoying the attention like a stage performer under bright lights. "You see," she continued confidently, "nobody is trying to cause trouble here. We just need the keys until the board determines how the pool will be shared with the community." Shared with the community. The phrase hung in the air like a decision already made. Officer Hayes stepped half a pace closer, his shadow stretching across the driveway between us. "Sir," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "you can make this simple or you can make it complicated. But if you continue refusing a reasonable request tied to a community complaint, I will have to document that refusal." Victoria's smile widened again. That was exactly the kind of line she wanted on video. Proof that she had followed procedure. Proof that the stubborn homeowner down the street had forced her hand. I watched both of them for a moment before speaking again. "Document whatever you need," I said evenly. "But since we are talking about official documentation now, I think we should slow down for a second and make sure everyone here understands what authority actually applies to this situation." Victoria blinked once, clearly confused by the direction of the conversation. Officer Hayes frowned slightly, the confidence in his expression shifting just enough to notice. The quiet street around us seemed to grow even stiller as the neighbors continued watching from their doorways. I slipped my hand into the inside pocket of my shirt and felt the familiar weight of the leather wallet resting there. The movement caught Victoria's attention immediately, and she leaned forward slightly, eager to capture whatever happened next on her camera. She still believed the next thing I would pull out was a set of pool keys. Instead, I rested my thumb against the edge of the wallet and looked directly at Officer Hayes again, my voice steady and calm. "Because once we start documenting things officially," I said, "the reason you came here today becomes very important." For a moment, nobody moved. The warm breeze drifted through the cul-de-sac, rustling the leaves of the small maple tree beside my driveway, while the patrol car engine continued its steady idle behind Officer Hayes. Victoria Hayes leaned forward slightly, her phone raised higher now, the glass lens reflecting a tiny square of sunlight. She was smiling again, the confident smile of someone certain that the scene was about to end exactly the way she imagined. From her perspective, the story was simple. Stubborn homeowner. HOA president enforcing community standards. Police officer ensuring cooperation. It was the kind of tidy suburban narrative that plays well in neighborhood group chats and HOA board meetings. But stories change quickly when the wrong details appear on camera. My fingers slid the leather wallet out of my shirt pocket slowly enough that both of them could see the movement clearly. Victoria shifted her grip on the phone to keep the frame centered on my hands. "Finally," she said softly, almost to herself, like someone watching the final move of a chess match she believed she had already won. Officer Hayes watched the wallet appear with the same calm expression he had worn since arriving. In his mind, this was the moment where the argument ended. The keys would appear. The camera would capture compliance. Everyone would go home. Instead, I flipped the wallet open and held it up so he could see the badge and identification inside. The gold shield caught the late afternoon sunlight and flashed brightly for half a second. The words beneath it were small but unmistakable. Federal Bureau of Investigation. For a moment, the only sound in the driveway was the low hum of the cruiser engine and the distant whir of a lawn mower somewhere beyond the block. Officer Hayes did not say anything. His eyes moved from the badge to my face and then back to the badge again, as if he needed a second look to confirm what he was seeing. Victoria blinked once, clearly unsure why the moment had not unfolded the way she expected. The phone in her hand tilted slightly as her arm lowered a few inches. "What is that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice losing a small piece of its earlier confidence. I kept the wallet open just long enough for Officer Hayes to read the identification clearly before closing it again and slipping it back into my pocket. "It means," I said calmly, "that the conversation we are having right now is no longer just a homeowners association disagreement." The officer's posture changed almost immediately. It was subtle, the kind of shift most people would miss. His shoulders straightened. His grip tightened slightly on the clipboard. The easy confidence he had walked onto my driveway with faded into something more cautious. Victoria glanced between us, confused by the sudden tension she could not yet explain. "Daniel," she said quietly, lowering the phone another inch. "What is he talking about?" Officer Hayes did not answer right away. His eyes remained on me for another second as the pieces began fitting together in his mind. The name Caldwell, the federal badge, the careful way I had framed every sentence since he arrived. When he finally spoke, his voice was noticeably different. "Ma'am," he said slowly without taking his eyes off me, "you might want to stop recording for a moment." Victoria frowned, clearly irritated. "Why would I do that?" she asked. I looked at the patrol car behind him, then back at the nameplate on his uniform. "Because," I said quietly, "the reason you came here today might end up in a federal report." Victoria Hayes did not lower the phone completely, but the confident smile she had been wearing all afternoon disappeared as if someone had quietly switched off a light. Her eyes moved from my face to her husband and back again, searching for some explanation that would restore the simple story she had been filming a few seconds earlier. The late afternoon sun had dipped lower now, casting long shadows across the driveway and turning the chrome on the patrol car into dull silver instead of bright glare. For the first time since arriving, Officer Hayes looked uncomfortable standing there. Not frightened, not panicked, just suddenly aware that the situation had become more complicated than he expected. The clipboard in his hand lowered slowly to his side. "Sir," he said carefully, choosing his words with more attention than before, "if you are saying you work with a federal agency, that still does not change the homeowners association complaint." His voice carried the tone of someone trying to steer the conversation back onto familiar ground. I nodded once, acknowledging the point. "You are right," I said calmly. "The HOA complaint does not change. What changes is the context around why you are here and how this conversation started." Victoria finally lowered the phone another inch. "This is ridiculous," she said sharply. "You cannot just flash some badge and pretend the HOA rules do not apply." Her voice echoed slightly across the quiet street. A curtain across the road shifted again as one of the neighbors adjusted their view. Victoria noticed and straightened her posture, trying to reclaim the authority she had been projecting earlier. "Daniel, tell him," she said, gesturing toward me with her free hand. "The association has every right to request access to community facilities." Officer Hayes did not answer right away. His attention remained fixed on me, the way someone watches a chessboard after realizing a move might have consequences they did not see before. "What context are you referring to?" he asked finally. The breeze moved across the yard again, stirring the surface of the pool behind me so the water rippled softly against the tile edge. The sound carried faintly through the open gate, quiet and steady. I glanced briefly toward the street, where the neighbors still hovered in their doorways pretending not to watch. Then I looked back at Officer Hayes. "The reason I moved into this neighborhood 14 months ago," I said, keeping my voice calm and even, "was not because I needed a pool or a quiet cul-de-sac." Victoria frowned as if the sentence made no sense. "Then why did you move here?" she demanded. I watched the officer carefully as I answered. "Because the city surrounding this neighborhood has been part of an ongoing federal investigation," I said. The words hung in the air between us. Victoria blinked again, clearly trying to process the idea. Officer Hayes remained very still, his expression tightening slightly. "An investigation into what?" he asked. I met his eyes and spoke the next words slowly enough that the camera in Victoria's hand could still capture them clearly. "Contract approvals, zoning changes, and a network of quiet favors moving through city offices," I said. "And a few names connected to those approvals." Victoria laughed once, a quick nervous sound. "This has nothing to do with our association," she insisted. I tilted my head slightly toward the badge on Officer Hayes' uniform. "That depends," I said quietly, "on why a city police officer decided to step into a private homeowners association dispute on behalf of his wife." The question settled into the driveway like a stone dropped into still water. For the first time since arriving, Officer Hayes glanced back at his patrol car, then at the neighbors watching from their houses, before returning his attention to me. The confident rhythm of the scene had vanished. Now every word mattered. The quiet that followed my question felt heavier than the summer air hanging over the cul-de-sac. For a moment nobody spoke. The patrol car engine continued its steady idle behind Officer Hayes, and somewhere in the distance a screen door creaked shut as one of the neighbors slowly retreated inside. Victoria Hayes still held her phone, but the camera had dipped slightly now, no longer aimed perfectly at my face. The confident performance she had started with was slipping. "This is completely absurd," she said finally, her voice sharper than before, but noticeably less steady. "Daniel is here because the association asked for assistance. That is not illegal." Officer Hayes shifted his stance again, the gravel under his boot crunching softly. He looked from me to Victoria and back again, measuring every word before speaking. "The association requested a presence," he said carefully. "Nothing more than that." I nodded once. "That is what you told yourself," I replied calmly. "But when a uniformed officer steps onto private property during a dispute that benefits a member of his own household, the situation starts to look different on paper." Victoria frowned, clearly irritated. "On what paper?" she demanded. I tilted my head slightly toward the patrol car behind him. The radio inside the vehicle crackled faintly for a second before going silent again. "The kind that ends up in an internal review," I said. Officer Hayes remained very still. I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes now. He understood exactly what I meant. A police officer using department resources during a personal dispute was not a simple homeowners association matter anymore. It was the kind of thing that attracted attention from supervisors, auditors, and occasionally people who asked uncomfortable questions. Victoria looked between us again, frustration rising in her expression. "You are trying to scare us with technicalities," she snapped. "The HOA has rules, and you are breaking them." I glanced past her toward the quiet houses lining the street. A few of the watching neighbors had disappeared from their windows, but the Johnson family's front door remained slightly open, just enough for someone to keep listening. The whole neighborhood had felt the shift in the conversation. The confident spectacle Victoria had planned was dissolving into something slower and far less predictable. I looked back at Officer Hayes. "You said earlier you would document my refusal," I reminded him calmly. "That documentation would include the reason you arrived here, the nature of the complaint, and the relationship between you and the person requesting enforcement." The officer exhaled slowly through his nose. His shoulders lowered slightly, as if the weight of the afternoon had finally settled in. Victoria stared at him. "Daniel, you are not actually listening to this nonsense, are you?" she said. He did not answer her right away. Instead, he looked back at me with a much more measured expression than before. "If what you are suggesting is accurate," he said slowly, "then this conversation probably needs to end here." Victoria's eyes widened. "What do you mean end here?" she demanded. I stepped back toward the gate leading to my backyard, the warm concrete still radiating heat through the evening air. The pool water behind me rippled quietly again, reflecting the fading sunlight like a sheet of blue glass. "It means," I said calmly, "that the safest decision for everyone involved would be to treat this exactly what it is." Officer Hayes watched me closely. "And what is that?" he asked. I met his eyes and answered in the same steady voice I had used since the beginning. "A private homeowners association disagreement that does not require a police officer standing in my driveway." For several seconds the driveway remained completely still. The breeze that had been moving through the cul-de-sac earlier had faded, leaving the warm evening air quiet and heavy. Officer Hayes looked from me to the gate behind me, where the blue surface of the pool shimmered faintly in the fading sunlight. Then he looked toward the houses lining the street. A few neighbors were still watching, though they tried to pretend otherwise by standing half-hidden behind doors or curtains. The scene Victoria Hayes had hoped would end with a public victory had turned into something very different. The clipboard in Officer Hayes's hand lowered slowly until it rested against his leg. The confidence he arrived with had been replaced by careful consideration. "Victoria," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off me, "this is not something the department needs to be involved in." The words seemed to land harder than anything that had been said all afternoon. Victoria blinked once as if she had not heard him correctly. "Excuse me," she said sharply. "You are already here." Officer Hayes finally turned toward her. "And I should not have been," he replied, his voice calm but firm now. The patrol car engine continued its low hum behind him as he reached up and adjusted the radio on his shoulder. Victoria's mouth opened slightly in disbelief. "Daniel, the association asked for help," she insisted. "That is exactly what you are doing." He shook his head once. "No," he said quietly. "What I am doing is leaving before a private disagreement turns into something that causes problems for the department." The words hung in the air for a moment. Victoria looked from her husband to me again, clearly trying to understand how the moment had slipped out of her control. The phone in her hand lowered another inch until the camera was pointed toward the pavement instead of my face. Across the street, a garage door slowly rolled down as one of the neighbors finally stepped away from the show. Officer Hayes walked back toward the cruiser with the measured steps of someone who had already decided the outcome. The gravel crunched softly under his boots as he opened the driver's door. Before getting inside, he paused and looked back toward me one last time. There was no hostility in his expression now, only the quiet understanding that the afternoon had almost become something much larger than a homeowners association dispute. I gave him a small nod. He returned it, then slid into the driver's seat. The patrol car door shut with a solid thud that echoed briefly down the street. The engine revved slightly as he shifted the vehicle into gear. Victoria stood frozen in the driveway for a moment, still holding the phone loosely in her hand. The confident posture she had carried earlier was gone. Without another word, the cruiser rolled slowly down the street and turned the corner, disappearing behind the row of identical houses. The cul-de-sac returned to its normal quiet. Sprinklers resumed their steady ticking. The smell of evening barbecue drifted across the neighborhood again. Victoria looked at me one last time, frustration written across her face, then turned and walked quickly back toward her house without saying another word. I stepped through the gate and closed it behind me. The soft sound of water moving in the pool filled the backyard again as the last of the sunlight reflected across the surface. The keys to the gate were still exactly where they had been all afternoon. And sometimes that is how justice actually works. No shouting, no spectacle, just the quiet moment when the wrong person realizes they picked the wrong house.